It was 1341 at the University of Cambridge. A young man named Nicholas de Cantilupe, not yet 20 years old, pulled the hood of his robe tighter around his face. The wind coming off the River Cam was relentless, even inside the stone walls of his college. The robe, his kappa, was made of heavy, dark wool. It was a requirement. The university statutes, based on rules set down decades earlier, were strict. Every scholar, from the newest bachelor to the most esteemed master, had to wear clerical-style attire. Nicholas wasn't a monk, not yet anyway, but he dressed like one. His life was one of study, prayer, and discipline, and the robe was a constant part of that life. The most useful part of his entire outfit was the hood, or cuculus. It was a simple piece of fabric, a cowl attached to a small cape that covered his shoulders. When the wind howled through the unglazed windows of the lecture hall, he could pull it up over his head for warmth. When he knelt for prayers in the drafty chapel, it kept the chill off his neck. It was purely functional. He didn't know it, but the simple practical hood he wore every day for survival would survive for centuries. It would slowly lose its function. The cowl part would flatten out and fall permanently down his back. The small cape would grow and change shape. It would eventually be lined with silk and trimmed with velvet, a blaze of color representing a degree he could not yet imagine. The hood Nicholas wore to keep warm in 1341 is the direct ancestor of the elaborate symbolic hood a Cambridge graduate receives today. It is a piece of the 14th century worn in the 21st. Number 10, the gown itself is a tunic meant for monks. In the year 1215, a student named Jean at the fledgling University of Paris felt trapped. It was not the curriculum that bothered him, nor the long hours spent copying text by candlelight. It was his clothes. Specifically, it was the kappa of the closed cope that he was forced to wear every single day. A papal decree issued by the legate Robert de Courcon had formalized many of the university's rules. One of the strictest rules concerned dress. All scholars were considered part of the clergy, at least in a minor sense. They enjoyed benefit of clergy, which meant they could be tried in a more lenient church court instead of the king's brutal secular courts. But this privilege came with obligations. They had to look the part. The kappa clausa was essentially a long, heavy tunic sewn shut all the way down the front. It had no fashionable open front like the robes worn by knights or wealthy merchants. To put it on, Jean had to pull it over his head like a sack. It was made of cheap, undyed wool, usually black or a dark brown, a color meant to signify humility and a rejection of worldly vanity. The statutes were clear. Students were forbidden from wearing pointed shoes, elaborate belts, or anything that smacked of secular fashion. Jean saw this as a deliberate form of control. The robe was hot in the summer and cumbersome when navigating the muddy, crowded streets of the Latin Quarter. More than that, it was a uniform that separated him and his fellow students from the rest of the city. This separation was the entire point. The town versus gown rivalry was a real and often violent part of medieval university life. A student's distinct dress marked him as part of a privileged and often resented group. Fights, riots, and even deaths were common. The simple closed robe was a kind of protection, a clear sign that its wearer belonged to the university and the church, not to the city guilds or the king's men. It was also a form of social leveling. A wealthy student from a noble family had to wear the same basic robe as a poor scholar who subsisted on charity. Inside the university walls, the mind was supposed to matter more than birth, and the uniform was a physical manifestation of that ideal. Of course, the reality was different. The rich student's kappa might be made of a finer wool, and he could afford a warm fur lining for winter that Jean could only dream of. Still, from a distance they look the same. This basic sack-like garment is the direct ancestor of the modern academic gown. The bachelor's gown, in particular, retains this simplicity. In the American system, it is a plain robe with long, pointed sleeves, still closed at the front. It is unadorned, reflecting the status of an apprentice scholar, just as Jean was in 1215. The evolution to the master's and doctoral gowns involved opening the front of the robe and changing the sleeve shape. Developments that came centuries later as university masters began to see themselves less as humble clerics and more as a distinct professional class. But the fundamental garment, the black tunic that sets the wearer apart from the everyday world, is a direct holdover from the days when a student in Paris needed a uniform to distinguish him from a baker or a soldier, for his own safety and as a sign of his commitment to a life of the mind. Number 9. The hood was a built-in wallet and lunch pouch. Let's travel to Oxford in the year 1370. A young scholar named Walter is walking through the narrow streets, his worn wool robe pulled tight against the damp cold. He is a poor scholar, one of the many students who relied on the charity of others to fund their education. His most essential piece of clothing is his hood. In Latin, it was called the capudium. It served multiple purposes. First, it was a hat. The cowl part could be pulled over his head to protect him from the rain and the biting wind that seemed a permanent feature of the English climate. The capelet part covered his shoulders, providing an extra layer of insulation over his tunic, but the hood had another, more critical function. Attached to the back of the cowl was a long, tapering tail of fabric known as a liripipe. This tail was incredibly versatile. Walter could wrap it around his neck like a scarf for extra warmth. He could also use it to carry things, tucking his small book of psalms into its folds. The most important function of the hood, however, was as a pouch. The cowl itself, when not on his head, could be used as a makeshift bag. When a kind merchant or a wealthy churchman offered alms, Walter would hold out his hood to receive a small coin, a piece of bread, or an apple. It was a common sight in medieval university towns, students using their hoods to collect donations. This practice was so common that the hood became associated with the act of begging, a humble necessity for those pursuing knowledge without independent means. The liripipe itself also became a fashion statement over time. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, the tail grew longer and longer, sometimes reaching the ground. It was a sign of status and fashion, a direct contradiction of its humble origins. Men would wrap the liripipe around their heads in elaborate styles, creating a kind of turban. This evolution is key to understanding the modern academic hood. As hats became more popular in the 16th and 17th centuries, the need to wear the hood on the head diminished. It began to be worn draped over the shoulders and down the back purely as a decorative and symbolic item. The part that once covered the head, the cowl, flattened out. The part that covered the shoulders, the cape, remained. And the long tail, the liripipe, shrank over time into the small vestigial ribbon of fabric you can still see on the back of many modern hoods. The function was completely gone, but the form remained. When you look at a modern graduation hood, you are seeing a ghost of Walter's life. The large colored silk lining represents the university and the specific college, a burst of pride that would have been unimaginable to a poor scholar in a plain wool hood. The velvet trim along the edge, its color dictated by the field of study, is a later codification of academic faculties. The shape itself, the flattened cowl and the cape, is a direct echo of the medieval capudium. It is no longer used to keep warm or to collect alms. Its purpose is now entirely symbolic, a colorful and complex signifier of academic achievement, but its very existence is a holdover from a time when it was one of the most practical and essential pieces of a student's daily attire. Number 8. The shape of your sleeve broadcasted your academic rank. It is 1485, the final year of the Wars of the Roses. In the relative peace of Cambridge, a man named Thomas Rotherham, the chancellor of the university, is focused on matters of internal order, not the battlefields. One of his concerns is the proper dress of the university's members. He issues statutes that are incredibly specific about what each rank of scholar can and cannot wear. For Thomas, clothing was not a trivial matter. It was a visual representation of the university's strict hierarchy. The most telling detail was the sleeve of the academic gown. A bachelor, an undergraduate who had earned his first degree, was an apprentice in the world of scholarship. His gown, according to the statutes, was to have simple, pointed sleeves. This style was practical, unadorned, and similar to the sleeves on the tunics of other apprentices in trades like carpentry or masonry. It signified that the bachelor's work was not yet done. He was still in a state of training. A Master of Arts, however, was a different story. Once a scholar had completed his master's degree, he was considered a full member of the academic guild. He was qualified to teach, his status was elevated, and his sleeves showed it. The master's gown featured long, closed sleeves that reached down to the wearer's feet. Near the wrist, there was a slit through which the master could pass his hands and arms. This design was profoundly impractical for any kind of manual labor. You could not plow a field or hammer a nail with these sleeves. That was precisely the point. The long, closed sleeve was a direct imitation of the attire worn by the nobility and the gentry. It was a powerful visual statement that its wearer belonged to a class of men who worked with their minds, not their hands. It was a mark of professional and social distinction. The highest rank, the doctor, had even more elaborate sleeves. A doctor of theology, law, or medicine wore a grander scarlet gown, often with full bell-shaped sleeves. This voluminous sleeve was another sign of prestige and authority. It used more fabric, which was expensive, and its shape was imposing. It set the doctor apart, not just from the townspeople, but from the lower ranks of his own university. This intricate system of sleeve-based rank is preserved almost perfectly in the academic regalia used in the United States today. The American Intercollegiate Code of Academic Costume, first established in 1895 and revised since, is a direct descendant of the rules laid down by men like Thomas Rotherham. The code specifies 3 distinct sleeve shapes. The bachelor's gown has pointed sleeves, just like the apprentice scholar's gown of the 15th century. The master's gown has what are called oblong sleeves. They are long and closed at the end with a distinctive arc cut into the back and a slit at the front for the wearer's arms. This is a stylized version of the impractical, high-status sleeve of the medieval master. The doctoral gown has large bell-shaped sleeves. This is the most visible difference, and it is often, further embellished with 3, velvet bars or chevrons on each sleeve, a tradition we will explore later. So when you watch a graduation procession, you are seeing a medieval hierarchy made visible. You can tell just by looking at the sleeves who is the apprentice, who is the qualified master, and who is the senior doctor. The language of the sleeves, first written down in the 15th century, is still being spoken today. Number 7, the mortarboard began as a simple skull cap for priests. In 1560, Matthew Parker, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was trying to bring order to the Church of England after decades of religious turmoil. He issued a series of advertisements or regulations that dictated, among other things, the proper attire for clergy and, by extension, for academics at Oxford and Cambridge, which were still fundamentally religious institutions. One item he was particularly concerned with was headwear. He insisted that all clergy and masters of arts should wear a specific type of hat, the pileus quadratus, or square cap. This was not a new invention, but Parker's insistence on its use helped solidify its place in academic tradition. The story of this iconic piece of headwear begins much earlier, with a simple round, close-fitting skull cap called the pileus rotundus. This was a common type of hat in the Middle Ages, worn by various classes of people. Clerics, however, adopted a particular version of it, often called a zucchetto. It was a sign of their clerical status. Over time, this round cap began to evolve. In the 14th and 15th centuries, a new style of hat, the biretta, became popular among clergy. The biretta was a taller, stiffer cap, often with 3 or 4 ridges or horns on top, rising from a square base. It was more substantial and formal than the simple skull cap. The academic world, always closely tied to the church, adopted this style, standardized for masters and doctors. Initially, the academic square cap was soft and foldable. It was essentially a skull cap with a soft, floppy, square top sewn onto it. You can see this version in many portraits from the Tudor and Stuart periods. It was known simply as the square cap. The rigid flat board we know today as the mortarboard is a much later development. The name mortarboard itself seems to have appeared in the 19th century, a piece of student slang that compared the flat top of the cap to the square board used by a bricklayer to hold mortar. This transformation from a soft, foldable cap to a stiff, flat board likely happened in the 18th century. It involved inserting a piece of stiff card or wood into the top to maintain a perfect square shape. This made the hat more formal and less practical, a common theme in the evolution of academic dress. A tuft or tassel was attached to the center of the board. This, too, had its origins in ecclesiastical and noble headwear, where tassels were used as signs of rank. A famous story from 17th century Oxford surrounds Dr. John Fell, the Dean of Christ Church. He was a notorious disciplinarian who was said to have inspired the rhyme, "I do not like thee, Dr. Fell, the reason why I cannot tell." He was a stickler for tradition and would have insisted on the proper wearing of the square cap by his students. For him, it was not just a hat, it was a symbol of academic discipline and conformity to the university's rules. The modern mortarboard is the direct, if somewhat comical, endpoint of this long evolution. It is worn today by graduates from kindergarten to doctoral programs around the world. The tradition of moving the tassel from one side to the other upon receiving a degree is a very recent invention, likely from the early 20th century, with no medieval precedent. But the cap itself, the square shape, the tassel, the very idea of a distinct academic hat is a holdover from the days when Archbishop Parker wanted to make sure his priests and professors were properly and uniformly attired, linking them back to a long tradition of clerical headwear. Number 6. The velvet on a doctor's gown was a sumptuary law workaround. In 1533, King Henry VIII of England, a man obsessed with status and appearance, passed one of his many sumptuary acts. These were laws designed to regulate what people of different social classes could wear. The goal was to maintain the social hierarchy and prevent commoners from dressing like nobles. The laws were incredibly detailed, specifying who could wear silk, who could wear purple, and, most importantly for our story, who could wear velvet. Velvet, a fabric with a dense cut pile, was enormously expensive to produce. It was made from silk, and its rich texture and deep sheen made it the ultimate luxury fabric. Under Henry's law, only the highest echelons of the nobility, dukes, marquises, and earls were permitted to wear gowns made entirely of velvet. Lesser nobles and wealthy merchants might be allowed to use it as a trim on their garments, but its use was strictly controlled. This created a dilemma for the universities. The highest academic rank, the doctor, was a position of immense prestige. As a doctor of divinity or law was a major figure in society, often an advisor to kings and bishops. They needed to dress in a way that reflected their status. But they were not, in the strict sense, part of the nobility. They were commoners by birth, however learned. They could not simply wear a full velvet robe, so a compromise emerged, one that respected the sumptuary laws while still elevating the doctor's appearance. The doctoral gown remained a robe of fine wool or for festive occasions, silk, but it was adorned with velvet. Broad facings of velvet were added down the front of the gown, and 3 horizontal bars of velvet, known as chevrons, were added to each of the full bell-shaped sleeves. This was a brilliant piece of visual communication. It used the luxury fabric, velvet, in a significant and highly visible way, but not in a quantity that would violate the sumptuary laws. It marked the wearer as a person of great importance, a doctor, without claiming the hereditary status of a nobleman. The choice of color for the velvet was also significant. Doctors of divinity often wore black velvet, a sober and authoritative color. Ear doctors of law might wear purple velvet, a color associated with royalty and justice. Doctors of medicine sometimes used a dark green. This use of velvet as a status marker became a core part of the academic dress code. A man named Andrew Boord, a physician who received his medical degree from Oxford around 1520, would have been one of the first generations of scholars to wear this new style of doctoral robe. For him, the velvet panels on his gown were not just decoration. They were his license to practice, a public declaration of his expertise recognized by both the university and the crown. They allowed him to navigate the complex social world of the Tudor court, where what you wore was who you were. The modern doctoral gown, particularly in the American system, is a direct inheritance of this 16th century solution. The 3 velvet bars on the sleeves and the velvet facings down the front are the most prominent features that distinguish a doctoral gown from a master's or bachelor's gown. The color of the velvet now signifies the specific field of study: dark blue for philosophy PhD, green for medicine, purple for law, and so on. This color code is a more modern systemization, but the fundamental idea of using velvet to denote the highest academic rank is a direct holdover from the Tudor period, a clever workaround to the strict sumptuary laws of a fashion-conscious king. Number 5. The colors in the hood are a direct link to medieval faculties. Imagine the University of Paris in the year 1300. It is the intellectual center of Europe. The university is not a single campus, but a collection of colleges and teaching houses. The most important organizational structure is the faculty. There were four main faculties: theology, canon law, medicine, and the lower faculty of arts. Each faculty was a powerful self-governing body, a guild for its particular branch of knowledge, and like any guild, they had their own traditions, their own rules, and their own colors. The faculty of theology was the most prestigious. Theology was known as the queen of the sciences. Theologians at Paris wore robes of scarlet, a brilliant, expensive red dye derived from the kermes insect. This was a color with immense power. It was the color worn by cardinals in the Catholic Church, the princes of the church. By adopting scarlet, the doctors of theology were making a bold statement about their importance and their proximity to the ultimate sources of power, both divine and earthly. The faculty of canon law, which studied the law of the church, also used a shade of red or purple, colors associated with justice and ecclesiastical authority. The faculty of medicine, a more practical and less prestigious field at the time, was often associated with the color green. This connection might stem from the green herbs and plants that formed the basis of medieval medicine. The faculty of arts, the largest and most junior faculty, which all students had to pass through, was associated with the color white, from the undyed wool of the simple clerical robes, or sometimes blue, a color associated with philosophy and truth. And a student named Thomas Aquinas, who studied and later taught at the University of Paris a few decades earlier in the mid-13th century, would have been intimately familiar with this color system. When he became a Master of Theology, his regalia would have included the magnificent scarlet of his faculty. This color was not just decorative, it was his professional identity. It announced to the world that he was a member of the most elite academic body in Christendom. This system, where a specific color is used to represent a specific field of academic study, is the direct ancestor of the modern academic color code. The system we use today was largely standardized by the American Intercollegiate Code of 1895, but the choices of colors were not random. The commission that created the code looks back to these medieval traditions. The dark blue that represents the Doctor of Philosophy PhD is a nod to the blue associated with the Faculty of Arts, the liberal arts that form the foundation of all higher learning. The scarlet or red for theology degrees is a direct continuation of the Paris tradition. The purple for law and the green for medicine are also direct inheritances. Over the years, the system has expanded to include dozens of other colors for new fields of study, like blue for education, orange for engineering, pink for music, gold and yellow for science. But the core principle remains the same. When a graduate walks across the stage, the velvet trim on their hood tells a story. That thin band of color is a code, a visual language that connects their 21st century degree in, say, nursing apricot or forestry russet back to the powerful, color-coded academic guilds of 13th century Paris, where the color of your robe declared your intellectual allegiance and your place in the world of ideas. Number 4, the ceremonial mace was once a bodyguard's weapon. In 1262, the city of Bologna, Italy, was a dangerous place. The University of Bologna was one of the oldest and most famous in the world, but it was a student university. This meant the students themselves held the power. They hired and paid the professors, and they elected one of their own to be the rector, the head of the university. The rector was often a young man, sometimes in his early 20s, but he held immense authority. He had legal jurisdiction over all students and professors. This often put him in direct conflict with the powerful city authorities. A young man named Giovanni, elected rector for a 1-year term, knew the risks of arguments over rent, the price of books, or a student's arrest for drunkenness could quickly escalate into full-blown riots between the university members, the gown, and the local citizens, the town. The rector's personal safety was a serious concern. To protect him, the university employed officials known as beadles or bidelli. The beadle's job was to be the rector's assistant, messenger, and most importantly, his bodyguard. And as a bodyguard in the 13th century, the beadle carried a weapon. It was not a sword, which was the weapon of a nobleman. It was a mace. The medieval mace was a brutally simple and effective weapon. It was a heavy club, often made of wood or metal, sometimes with a flanged or knobbed head designed to crush armor. It was a weapon of authority, often carried by the sergeants at arms who protected a king or a high official. When the rector of Bologna walked in a formal procession, he was preceded by his beadle, who held the mace upright. This was a clear and unambiguous signal to everyone. It said, "This man is the head of the university. He has authority, and he is protected." The mace was a real weapon, and the threat of its use was equally real. Over the centuries, as universities became more established and less prone to violent street battles, the function of the mace began to change. The need for the beadle to be a literal bodyguard faded, but the tradition of carrying the mace in processions continued. The mace itself began to transform from a weapon of war into a work of art. By the 15th and 16th centuries, universities were commissioning elaborate ceremonial maces made of silver and gold. They were decorated with intricate engravings, the university's coat of arms, and other symbols of learning and authority. The head of the mace, once designed to crush a helmet, was now crafted into a delicate crown or representation of the university's main building. It was no longer a weapon, but a symbol of the university's corporate authority and its independence. The beadle, now known as the Esquire Bedell or Chief Marshal, still carried it at the head of all academic processions, at matriculation, at important ceremonies, and especially at graduation. This tradition is alive today. At nearly every major university commencement, the academic procession is led by a marshal carrying a heavy, ornate mace. It is a moment of high ceremony. The mace represents the authority of the university as a whole, and the power vested in it by its charter to grant degrees. Most people in the audience see it as just a beautiful, ancient-looking object, a piece of ceremonial pageantry. But its origins are much grittier. It is a direct holdover from a time of violence and instability, when the head of the university needed an armed guard to protect him from the angry citizens of his own city. The modern university mace is a bodyguard's club transformed by centuries of peace into a symbol of the knowledge it was once used to defend. Number 3, the chancellor's ornate robe is borrowed from a duke. Let's go to Oxford in 1630. The chancellor of the university is William Herbert, the 3rd Earl of Pembroke. He is a powerful nobleman, a patron of the arts, and a key figure at the court of King Charles I. He is not a full-time academic. The position of chancellor had, by this time, evolved into a high-status role held by a powerful external patron who could defend the university's interests at court and in parliament. The day-to-day running of the university was handled by the vice-chancellor, a resident academic. When the Earl of Pembroke visited Oxford for a major ceremony, he did not dress like a scholar. He did not wear the simple black robe of a master or even the scarlet and velvet gown of a doctor. He wore a robe that reflected his actual status in the world, that of a high-ranking nobleman. His ceremonial robe was made of black silk damask, a luxurious and expensive fabric with a woven pattern. It was heavily decorated with gold lace, arranged in specific patterns that indicated his rank as an earl. The cut of the robe was not the same as an academic gown. It was closer in style to the robes he would have worn to attend the coronation of the king or to sit in the House of Lords. This was a deliberate choice. The university, by having its titular headdress in the regalia of a peer of the realm, was visually linking itself to the highest levels of state power. It was a statement that the university was not just an isolated community of scholars, but a major institution of the kingdom, protected by and connected to the aristocracy. This tradition of the chancellor or university president wearing a unique, highly ornate, and often non-academic robe continues to this day. A man named Charles William Eliot, who became president of Harvard in 1869, felt the need for a similar kind of distinct regalia. He and other American university leaders in the late 19th century looked back to these English traditions when they were creating their own academic dress codes. The American system allows for the university's chief official, the president or chancellor, to wear a special robe of their own design. This robe often deviates significantly from the standard academic gown. It might be a different color, such as the crimson of Harvard or the blue of Yale. It is almost always more elaborate than a standard doctoral gown. It may feature 4 velvet chevrons on the sleeves instead of the usual 3, a modern invention to signify a rank higher than a standard doctor. The facings and sleeves might be adorned with gold or silver braid, a direct echo of the gold lace on the Earl of Pembroke's robe. When you see a university president leading a graduation ceremony, they stand out from the sea of black-robed faculty and graduates. Their unique gown is a symbol of their office. It sets them apart as the leader of the institution. But this tradition is not rooted in the medieval world of scholarship. It is not the robe of a master teacher. It is a holdover from the 17th century, from a time when universities sought the patronage of powerful aristocrats and adopted their patrons' own courtly and parliamentary dress to signify the university's connection to secular power and prestige. The president's robe is a piece of borrowed nobility, a symbol of institutional authority that comes from the world of dukes and earls, not the world of monks and scholars. Number 2, the tassel on the cap was originally a marker of social class. It is 1770 at the University of Oxford. A young man named Edward Gibbon, who would later write the monumental The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, is a student. He is what was known as a gentleman commoner. This was a special category of undergraduate student. Unlike the ordinary commoners who paid their own way, or the poorer scholars who received financial aid, the gentleman commoner was a wealthy young man from a landowning or aristocratic family. He paid higher fees, and in return, he received special privileges. He could dine at the high table with the college fellows, he had better rooms, and he was exempt from certain disciplinary rules and academic requirements. Most importantly, his superior social status was made visible by his clothing. He wore a more elaborate gown, often made of silk and decorated with tassels. But the most obvious marker was on his square academic cap. While an ordinary commoner wore a cap with a simple black tassel, the gentleman commoner was entitled to wear a cap with a tassel made of gold thread. A step above him was the nobleman commoner, the son of a peer, who was entitled to a cap with an even more elaborate gold tassel, sometimes called a tuft. This created a clear and visible class system within the student body. You could tell a student's social background and his level of privilege within the university simply by looking at the color of the tassel on his hat. It had nothing to do with academic merit. A brilliant but poor commoner wore black. A mediocre but wealthy gentleman wore gold. The system was not medieval in origin. It was a product of the 17th and 18th centuries, a period when the English universities became finishing schools for the sons of the gentry and aristocracy. The focus shifted from clerical training to providing a classical education and social polish for the nation's future rulers. Social distinction became paramount. The gold tassel was a powerful symbol in this world. It was a constant reminder of the rigid social hierarchy that existed outside the university walls and was being replicated within them. It was a source of pride for those who wore it and a source of resentment for those who did not. Samuel Johnson, who attended Oxford a few decades before Gibbon, was a poor commoner and would have worn the black tassel. He was acutely aware of the snobbery and privilege that the gold tassel represented. The modern academic tassel is a democratized descendant of this class-based system. The tradition of doctoral degree holders wearing a gold tassel is a direct link to the nobleman commoner's tuft. It has been repurposed to signify the highest level of academic achievement rather than inherited social rank. In the American system, the standard tassel for bachelors and masters is black, or it may be the color of the specific field of study. The idea of a special, distinct tassel for the highest rank remains. The practice of moving the tassel from the right side of the mortarboard to the left upon graduation is a modern American invention, a 20th century piece of ceremony with no historical basis. But the tassel itself, especially the distinction between a standard color and a gold one, is a faint echo of an 18th century English university system, where the thread on your cap was a public declaration of your family's wealth and your place in a deeply stratified society. Number 1, the cords and stoles are a faint echo of student guilds. In the year 1222, the University of Padua was founded. It was established by a group of professors and students who left the University of Bologna in protest over infringements on their academic freedom. Like Bologna, Padua was a student-run university. The student body was incredibly diverse, drawing scholars from all over Europe. To manage this diversity, the students organized themselves into nations. A nation was a kind of mutual aid society or guild for students from a particular geographic region. There were nations for the English, the Germans, the French, the Spanish, and many others. Each nation had its own elected leaders, its own statutes, and its own patron saint. They provided lodging for new students, offered financial assistance, and represented their members' interests within the university. A student named Albertus, who had traveled from the distant region of Flanders to study medicine in Padua, would have immediately joined the Germanic nation upon his arrival. This nation was his family away from home. It provided him with a social network and a safety net. The nations often distinguished themselves with specific colors or emblems. During processions or university festivals, members of a particular nation might wear a colored sash, ribbon, or other insignia to show their affiliation. This was a common practice in medieval guilds of all kinds, whether for weavers, stonemasons, or scholars. It fostered a sense of identity and solidarity. The use of these colored insignia was not part of the formal, university-mandated academic regalia. It was an informal, student-led tradition. It was a way for students to express an identity that was separate from their academic rank as a bachelor or master. It was about where you came from and which group you belonged to. This tradition, in a very broad sense, is the spiritual ancestor of the modern academic cords and stoles. The brightly colored cords worn by members of honor societies, or the stoles that represent a student's fraternity, sorority, or cultural affinity group, serve a similar purpose. They are additions to the formal academic regalia. The black gown, the hood, and the cap represent the university and the degree conferred. The cords and stoles represent a smaller, more specific affiliation within the larger university community. The direct historical line is not as clear as it is for the gown or the hood. The modern honor cord system, for example, was largely an invention of American honor societies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The tradition of wearing stoles representing student organizations is even more recent, but the underlying impulse is the same. They are a way to visually represent membership in a specific group. A student in Padua in 1222 wore a ribbon for his geographic nation. A student at a state university today wears a gold cord for the Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society or a stole with Greek letters for their social fraternity. Both are using a piece of colored fabric worn over the formal academic robe to communicate an important part of their identity and their university experience. It is a holdover of the idea that a student is not just an anonymous scholar, but a member of a smaller guild, a society within the larger republic of letters.